Hey guys, welcome to the Historical Podcast. This week we have a humongous dinner on our hands as me and Michael try to tackle the huge and untouched, pretty much fully untouched topic that is Ireland and the Wars of the Roses. And although a few historians have touched here and there on the topic, well, myself and Michael, as we were talking earlier, were discussing it really needs way more research, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's a huge topic, and it never gets touched on. And a lot of modern historians will quickly skip through. They'll highlight a few bits here and there that happened throughout the war, but other than that, War of the Roses is just seen as an English conflict, and Ireland doesn't get touched, although a lot happens, a lot of very important history, even more so if you're a medieval fan like I am, and Michael is as well. And so myself and Michael from Clans and Dynasties will be getting into this, and we'll be trying to work our way through this very large topic. To start with, I just want to give people a kind of background to the Wars of the Roses and what state Ireland was at. Interestingly enough, before I start, I just want to highlight that Ireland isn't a backwater at this period. If we use the example of Margaret O'Carr, in 1453, she has one of the biggest feasts in Europe, in Ireland. And what this highlights, and is, if you actually read the descriptions of Margaret O'Carr, is that she has a humongous banquet, and she was into going on pilgrimages throughout Europe, and she had made many contacts with many different Europeans, and so she invited all these nobles and ladies that she had made friends with back to Ireland for a humongous feast. And there people had seen her on the top of one of her tower houses and was greeted there as she would give them a fabulous speech, and she was dressed in a very golden dress as her husband would gallop around cheering and shouting, dressed all smart. And what's really interesting, as I said there, she was covered in a golden dress, and we know she had a very beautiful golden dress because we have found a very similar garment in the Waterford Medieval Museum, where there's these priest robes, the clergy robes, and it's covered in these actual solid gold. And in the earlier medieval period, people were dressed in silk, and that was quite expensive. That was really show off. But even today, to have an actual dress covered in gold is quite a massive deal. And as guests came in, they were greeted by many different music and all these different forms of entertainment that really blew the minds of the guests because they weren't used to Gaelic culture. So just to highlight the fact that Ireland isn't the backwater you would think entering into the Wars of the Roses. In fact, for the past 100 years, as England was involved in the 100-Year War, the Gaelic resurgence had really picked up and really brought Ireland into the medieval world. So although we have this belief that going into the Wars of the Roses that Gaelic Ireland is backwards and people were running around in animal skins and stuff, we can see by the example of Margaret O'Carroll going into the Wars of the Roses, that's not the case. This is actually the period where a lot of romantic images of princesses and Irish nobles, that sort of stuff really should be going into your imagination, going into the Wars of the Roses. But at the same time, the violence between the English and Irish hasn't really stopped. It's not the main focus of the Kingdom of England. In fact, the 100-Year War was before the War of the Roses. And in fact, Richard II, tried to have peace negotiations with the 100-Year War, so he could go over to Ireland and try to quell Ireland, to try to take Ireland back, but it would fail and would ultimately bring an end to Richard II, which would put down the foundation of what would become the Wars of the Roses. And with that, the reason why the English were so focused on Ireland was to civilize it, bring it under their control. And they tried doing that with the Statutes of Kilkenny. And then what the Statutes of Kilkenny were laws to try to make the Irish into English. They had to wear English dress. They had to ride horses like the English, as in have a saddle. And they would also have to speak English. But however, by the time we go into the Wars of the Roses, by 1455, most of Dublin, never mind the rest of Ireland, was heavily speaking Irish. And it really shows that the Gaelic resurgence had really dominated Ireland by that point. Would you have anything else to add, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, just on the whole thing that you've added there, or context, another thing to remember is that, England liked to claim lordship of Ireland, but they actually, even before the Gaelic resurgence, actually held very little, well, sort of not very little, but they didn't hold all of Ireland. There's still some major kingdoms in Ireland, major political players going on, big dynasties. And as you sort of said there, there's a constant warfare going on between these Irish families and the Irish and English families, with these families taking different sides at different times. We know of, Anglo-Norman families and, some of the Marcher families around Dublin. And so these are English predominant families suddenly becoming very Gaelicized and starting to become acting and reading in Gaelic style, taking Gaelic names, these and marrying Gaelic women and almost assimilating completely into Gaelic and Irish culture rather than the English culture. And this would continue right up till the 17th century. You would have families doing this. So this was an ongoing backwards and forwards, many, and the same with Irish families taken, with the Statutes of Kilkenny. One of the things in these laws that came through was the Anglicization of their Irish names, to drop things like the O and the Mac at the front, and even becoming things like change the name completely to Smith and Brown, which are now so common in as Irish names in Ireland. But if you actually do genetic research on these families, and you see that these families come from Gaelic families, these are, and this isn't just an event of, okay, Mrs. Smith had a dalliance with a Gagan guy in 1222. It's these are men that have living in the Pale who have changed their names to fit in with the statutes and the laws that are coming through. So but as Philip said there, we did see this revival coming through. We'd seen it sort of basically when the Gallowglass had started to arrive. This was sort of a super weapon against the Norman sort of war machine that stomped across Europe and further afield. So, and with them, they brought this resurgence. And like Philip has also touched on there, our sort of romance came with them and would blossom, especially during the 100 Years' War, when Ireland was given almost free rein to sort of take control. These Irish chieftains were given free rein to sort of take back a lot of their land, and this almost like nationalism of their culture sort of started to blossom. It's funny that English nationalism started to rise at the same time, against the French, and so we have this sort of it's almost like the rise of nationalism of these two sort of cultures, and they started to romanticize the past, started to really embellish in these stories of ancient times and ancient kings, so it's really an interesting time happening, not just militarily and this fighting backwards and forwards, but just politically and culturally.
It's very interesting what you hit the nail on the head here, that you do, and historians have noted that although this is the late medieval period where you still see feudalism and the words like Irish and English aren't used the way that we would use them today, you still see the very basics and the foundation of the early modern world as we go into the Renaissance, as we go into the Tudor period and stuff. It's in the Tudor period that with Elizabeth and Henry VIII that you actually hear words like the country of England and stuff, and that's where you see the real foundations. But the spirit of that, as you were saying there, comes from this period. For example, the Hundred-Year War, the war between England and France that was fought, I think it was actually fought for 125 years, and it just kind of rounded it off as its name. But within that, England had really put down the foundations of what it was to be English. And it was the same with the French. The French had put down, although France was heavily divided, and that's why England was able to go in and take full advantage of that during the Hundred-Year War. By the end of the war, under the likes of Joan of Arc and then future kings of France and stuff, you start to see the identity of what it is to be French. And the exact same thing was happening with the Gaelic. Gaelic culture, speaking Irish, these things, and looking back into the golden age of the Ian Ale and the Brian Boru's, looking at that caused a sense of, as you were saying there, this nationalism, this kind of culture that we are different, our laws are different, and we want to be governed independently away from England. And it's very important to look at this as we go into the Wars of the Roses. Now, before the coming of the English, Ireland at the time was very poorly governed. The English would, because they were at war with England, they would constantly take money out of Dublin. It was kind of one of the major stripes. Ireland was independent in the fact that the Lordship of Ireland was governed by the Irish Parliament, and they were somewhat independent to the English king, although they had to kind of give up their tribute and stuff. And that tribute was them, the English king going in, taking the money that he needs for the 100-Year War and never actually giving back. So there was constant money taking out. And so the banks were running dry in Ireland. And as part of the Wars of the Roses, the Irish wanted their own separate currency so they could be independent still further from England. And one of the families that were really pushing for that were the Fitzgeralds, because the Fitzgeralds were pushing for themselves to be king all but in name, as many historians still debate today. How you feel about that, Michael? I'm not quite sure which side are you on. Were they going independent? Were they actually completely loyal to the king? It's kind of one of those massive debates that many historians still have. I myself think, especially with their alliances with Italy and stuff, and later on, as we go into the Tudor period, their alliances with the Holy Roman Empire, it does personally make me question, I think they were probably pushing for their own independence. I'm not quite sure.
I've always had the opinion that it was like every sort of family, they took each step as it came, to them. Each. So if they got to the point, they're always striving for more power, but I don't think they have an end game of, right, we want to be kings of Ireland. I just think they're always striving for that wee bit more power, building that power base, securing the line, securing the future, their heirs, securing the land, securing wealth, all that sort of thing that you see of typical dynasties. And I think if they just got to the point where they could, take it, they would have done, but they never really got to that point where they could. I mean, they always just, and I think it's because England and other families were always trying to get at them, chasing at the heels, and they got to sort of, it's almost like downloading a old DVD or a game or something, and you get to 99%, and then an error message comes up, and I kind of get that sort of feeling from the Fitzgeralds that they would have done if they had the ability, but 9 times out of 10, these rebellions were purely for the fact that they were just trying to protect what they already had, or trying to get that little bit more, but not the whole shebang. So I think, they would have done but then again, I would claim that for just about anyone. If the Butlers, even later on, with their links to the royal family, even if they had got to a place where they could just do it, they would have done. But as we know, anyways, economically, Ireland was always hamstrung through the English government and the English crown, through the fact that it was basically used as a as the overdraft of their whenever anything got a bit tight or anything, they just sucked it out of Ireland, and which was the same even on local levels. If Dublin was getting poorer, it would just suck it out of the country. If Kilkenny and the Butlers were getting poorer or having anything, they just sucked it out of their wee country. So it's not like the English, they're mean, they just took everything out of Ireland. Everyone was doing it on every level, so it's just how it works. they often say cities are vacuums for economies and for countries. So, you know, but it did hamstring Ireland as an entity that really, if you were a noble in Ireland, yeah, you either had vast amounts of wealth and little manpower, or vast amounts of manpower and little wealth, and one of them was being taken to fight wars in France and Scotland and Wales. You know, it was often these wars were often at great expense of the Irish people and the English Anglo-Irish lords. So, yeah, just without going too much, I think if they'd had the opportunity.
If they had the opportunity, and they sure did have good excuses to go independent. As we said there, the constant currency problem, where England would just take money out. One of the second major problems, and I think I was reading the Geraldines, medieval Ireland, was that I think at one point there's only 40 men in Dublin, and the reason for that is because Ireland trying to bring men over from, first off, according to the statutes of Kilkenny, they had to recruit English stock. They had to recruit English men over. And the problem with that then is that trying to get English over when all the English want to do is fight in France is quite difficult. And even when the English were over, they didn't stay for very long. It wasn't long until whatever English men came over with their families and stuff, really didn't like Ireland. Ireland was a completely foreign country. For a country that they were supposed to be running, everybody was speaking Irish. Most people were trading in cattle and completely ignoring English currency. And to a Englishman who had moved over for work purposes and to serve in the English army, there was little opportunity for him. Yeah. And most of the work was also going to the Gallowglass. And it was kind of one of the major things that the Fitzgeralds and the Irish Parliament, that wasn't run by the Fitzgeralds, were fighting for, was the right for them to recruit more Gallowglass into their families and factions and stuff. The reason for that is because, as they were complaining there, they couldn't get English over, and the reason why the English didn't want to move to Ireland is, first off, they wanted to move to Scotland, fight in the 100-Year Wars in France, where it was more profitable for them. And it was just...
Well, that's the thing. We had... you had these two sort of campaigns almost, and you have France, where all the money is being pumped into that army.
Yeah.
So they're getting the best equipment, they're getting the best of everything. They're fighting in glorious country, basically, lovely sunshine, and they're vast vineyards and land and beautiful European women, and the spoils of war, and all this opportunity to go across there and earn that and fight there, and with the potential as well, being if you're a certain level of society, potential of being giving a plot of land over there to sort of, if you go across with your lord and then he makes you a tenant there, and good farming land. So all these benefits here, and then you go to Ireland fighting in the underfunded army, completely drained of all its resources because everything's going to France, in a really hospitable country. Not just, now we think of Ireland as just this wet, damp land, but it not only was it hospitable, marshes, malaria was rife in the country, absolutely rife. It was riddled all the English armies. Not only that, so you're underfunded, you're fighting side by side with Scottish, or now more Gaelicized, Irish Gallowglass. These guys that really just are laws unto their own and would have no problem splitting your head in two for looking at them wrong. These were rough men, and you're going across there, malaria risk. You've got the threat of basically in a country where your lord is the man who can protect you, and you can't be protected from these roving bands of clansmen just going in, wrecking stealing your cattle, stealing your women, just wrecking around them. You've got no hope. It's just manic. And like you said, anyone that did go across, they soon find themselves retreating further and further back to Dublin to try and get close to these walls. But even the suburbs of Dublin are starting to be overrun. And before you know it, they're just turning to it and going back to,
That's exactly it. Because since Richard II had been kicked out of Ireland and then eventually was usurped by Henry IV, which puts down the foundations of what would be the War of the Roses later on after the 100-Year War, is that straight away, those, as we were saying, the O'Donnells, the O'Neills, and various other Gaelic families up in the north, they move down and start to attack Louth and Meath. And they force Louth and Meath to pay the black rent. And for people who've never heard of black rent before, basically what it is that earlier on, the O'Briens tried to capture Limerick. Now, the O'Briens didn't understand how Limerick worked. So what happened was that eventually the people living in Limerick got sick of the O'Briens and they kicked them out. And the O'Briens identified straight away that they didn't understand how any of these major cities and trading areas worked. So what they did instead was that they would capture a territory. And instead of kicking out the nobles in that area, they would keep the nobles in that area to run the place for them pretty much. And they would put in what they call a black rent. And the black rent basically was them rocking up at least once a month or whenever, taking all the tax money that they wanted and then going back up into their castle, wherever it is. For example, the O'Briens would rock up into Limerick, take the black rent, and then go back up to Bunrai Castle and just live out there happy out with their black rent. And so what happened was that Louth and Meath were black rented. And obviously Meath, for example, was owned by Edward of York. So Edward of York was not a happy man. And furthermore, neither was many of the royals living in England who had territory in Meath, who found out that these barbaric Gaelic have now black rented their territories in Ireland, which isn't too good for the English. Like,
well, I said that at the start of the War of Roses, you had the O'Kellys take Athlone, a big trading hub at the time, big Norman settlement. The O'Kellys had taken it. The rumor is it was through the trick of a woman who the city had fell. I would put that down to medieval. The noble English could never, in a big city like Athlone, could never lose to the barbaric, Irish without trickery. I think it is a bit of a medieval spin there. Although it's in the annals, so at the same time we've got this sort of going on. But yeah, so they come in, and the Dillon family are one of the prominent sort of Anglo-Norman families there, and they would jostle that backwards and forwards for the next sort of like 20 years or something like that. So these families are the O'Kellys are doing as the O'Briens are doing, and other families, the O'Donnells are doing, going down and taking these major settlements. We see in Sligo, the O'Connor Sligos own the area around it, and but Sligo's a big trading hub there. We see the O'Donnells raiding down there, getting into sort of fights with the Burkes and Connacht. These sort of families are big sort of hitters at the time, and they're up to nonsense, like on a big scale. When really, as this war's just kicked off, 4055 is Athlone, and then, like I say, the O'Neills and the O'Donnells start kicking 10 bells out of each other. They just end up going mad. You've got even so bad as like the O'Neills end up getting us into O'Doherty territory and killing the O'Donnell heir and his McSweeney Gallowglass at the Battle of Castleford. So it's all hell has broke loose, not just in England, but in Ireland. There's a big. I think they sense weakness, but I think everyone senses weakness, and so all the big players. And let's just
because another problem, sorry for putting in there, Michael.
No,
another problem is bandits. Bandits are getting so fierce now. For most of the medieval period in Ireland, bandits would have stayed in the forest territories, up in the hilly mountains and stuff, and they would have waited for the opportunity for people to walk by in village, walk by the public roads and stuff, and then they would ambush them and attack them and stuff. But bandits leading up to the War of the Roses and the start of the War of the Roses are getting so fierce, they go into settlements and just murder entire settlements. And there are recorded records of people walking into their own settlement, seeing their family members butchered all over their house, and then seeing their bandit murderer of their family members just sitting down, eating a piece of chicken, just looking at him saying, "What's your problem? Do you want to be next?" Just completely comfort. And the reason why they're so comfortable is that a good chunk of Ireland is just so lawless going into the War of the Roses. And England is no different, as we move on to in a second. Um, what this causes is that England first off, they need to get rid of Edward of York. Edward of York and Henry the Sixth start to have a slight falling out, and it's mostly by the people who are surrounding Henry the Henry the Sixth. The people surrounding Henry the Sixth, Edward of York doesn't like, but Edward of York is very terrifying to Henry the Sixth because he, according to him, should be the rightful king of England. And so Henry the Sixth is like, look, your lands have all been taken up in Meath. Maybe you should go over and sort them out. So his queen basically gives him the hint, and he goes over. He's basically sent. He's not even told or anything. He's sent over to Ireland, where he's being made Lord of Ireland. And basically there, he, instead of going in there with an iron fist and clearing out the Gaelic and putting the Fitzgeralds back in line and putting the butlers back in line, because at the time as well, the butlers are also having a very bloody rivalship against the Talbot family in Dublin. So the streets of Dublin, just like everywhere else, are covered in blood. There are clashes between the butlers and the Talbot, between St. Patrick's Cathedral all the way up to Christchurch as well. So that whole street there between the two is just covered with gangs meeting up and just stabbing each other. So pretty much all of Ireland at this point is just covered in blood. And so when Edward of York comes in, instead of saying, oh, I'm the boss here, he starts meeting up with groups throughout Dublin. He starts meeting through various Gaelic clans and the lords in Meath and Louth. And he starts, instead of trying to remove all these people, he makes agreements with them. And he also becomes real buddy-buddy with the Fitzgeralds. The reason for this is because Edward of York actually is thinking about taking the crown. So instead of going off to Ireland to sort everybody else out, he turns around and he starts, most likely, was having secret meetings with these people and saying, I've got a war coming up soon. Do you want to come over with me to England later on and come and fight in some of these wars? One of these wars being an example of this being the Battle of Wakefield, where there is actually a good few Gallowglass and Kerns that are shipped over, and Irish nobility and stuff that's brought over with Edward to fight in these upcoming battles for the Wars of the Roses. So instead of making hostilities worse, he calms it down in Ireland, and then he starts to build up a political, especially with the Fitzgeralds. He starts to really, especially Desmond and Kildare Fitzgerald, really becomes buddy-buddy with the two of them. And he's only in Ireland for about a year, and then he goes back to England because a rebellion, Jake Code's rebellion, kicks off in 1451, which sends Edward back. And eventually Edward gets into the war, starts the War of the Roses, where he's actually killed in the Battle of Wakefield, and his son takes over. And eventually his son goes over, wins the battle, wins a few more battles, and eventually he becomes King Edward IV of England, interesting enough. And the Fitzgeralds then are put in a really powerful position against the Butlers. So it's quite interesting how there's switcheroo. Ireland goes from a place of chaos, but once the war comes in, it starts that Ireland itself, bandit attacks and so on and so forth, somewhat calms down. I think it may be because the country is more kind of concentrated, maybe.
No, I would go, because you start to see a lot more clan activity in this time amongst themselves. And I think that's why you sort of start to see the, like you said there, the minimizing of bandit activity, because no Gaelic chieftain can afford to be going off raiding and attacking someone in another territory, knowing that his flank is exposed and his children and his wives and everything at home are. So that you'll see, it was commonplace, this would go again right up to the 17th century, the O'Byrnes are renowned for taking Connacht rebels during the Elizabethan era, much to the dismay of the Bingham family. So this is happening all the way up to then, and now you would have basically, say, you had the Burkes and the O'Kellys neighbours going at each other. The O'Kellys
Yeah.
would turn around to bandits and rebels in those areas and go, come to us into our lands and we'll protect you, and in return you work for us. So and you see this sort of happening because there's the of course the battle in 1460s, so around the time you've seen like Edward taking the throne and stuff. You have Corker Baskin, the naval battle between the O'Donnells, and with the help of a branch of the O'Briens, they go and down to County Clare and massacre the McMahons and another branch of the O'Briens. And it's actually like part naval, part land battle. It's a big battle there. And it's a complete massacre down there. I want to say there's a link because there was a branch of O'Donnells who used to live in that area about 3 centuries before. So I don't know if there's a link there, but that's irrelevant. What I'm saying is these families are starting to knock. I mean, the annals from this point on literally are just filled with just backwards and forwards of these families going hell for leather. And the big players around this time are the O'Donnells. Surprisingly not the O'Neills in the sense the O'Neills are very active, but it's more, I think, a reaction to try and subdue the O'Donnells.
So, kind of what the conclusion we're kind of coming to is that it's more concentrated violence. It's not like bandits just, ambushing people. And it's a very good point that you bring up that most of these bandits would have just joined factions and stuff and got into more clan fighting and stuff. So before the War of the Roses, the bandits would have just kind of roamed around doing bandit stuff. And then into the War of the Roses, you would have had many of these young men. Because that's what these bandits are. They're just young men who fucking want to go out and cause problems. You would have had these young men then who have just joined one faction or another during the War of the Roses, which is quite, does that cause Ireland to become more safer or violent? Because at least that warband is over there. But if that warband is concentrated where you live, maybe it's not so safe after all.
Well, I mean, it's Gaelic culture at the time, and before and after. The style of warfare, had a gentlemanly aspect, although we do start to see some brutalities that are brought across, and then adopted by the, like you said earlier about the banditry going on. Around that time, the O'Neills and the O'Donnells went to Breffni, spent the night in a village, and then the next day just massacred it, and they went round raiding. These raidings have gone from this almost like cattle raiding to just full-blown warfare of massacring entire towns.
Because the literature is violent. It is very violent. Before that, I was coming across a lot of literature that was very much and even during the Tudor period, I don't think it's that bad either. Well, the later Tudor period, it does escalate.
It becomes very sectarian then, but that's a little bit, that's a different type of
But before the War of the Roses and that, it seems to be more of a banter, especially around 1433 and stuff. It's more kind of, oh, you took my cattle, I'll get your cattle next time. But from when I was reading from 1449, around that time, just before the War of the Roses and stuff, it's very violent. And they do talk about bandits. These are basically kind of like nomads who just are roaming around the countryside. And they get so brazen that they're going into villages now and just murdering their way around the village and stuff. And it's very brazen action, very disturbing stuff. And as you were saying there, it does seem to, these young fellas do seem to get more control. But even Ireland is violent, but so is England. England has numerous rebellions kicking off as well. It's not just an Irish problem. England seemed to be suffering as well from it.
In England, you had the border reivers in Scotland. These are associated now with Scottish. They've adopted Scottish clans and stuff like that. In the modern era, but these families, some of these families were effectively English. They lived on the English side of the border. I know the border changed various times, but at this time they're living on the English side of the border. They're expected by the lords to pay English taxes and rents, but these are reiver clans basically roaming the northern border of England, and they own it. They terrorize. You can't go from Scotland to England without passing through the Scottish Reavers on both sides. And complete banditry, light moving cavalry attacks, brutal attacks, raid in and out. This sort of raiding sort of thing isn't just seen in Ireland. Like you say, it's not just like localized to the barbaric Irish. The English are at it too, and and in Wales as well, you're having these sort of things going on as well. So it's not just like you say. It's not just the Irish, the barbaric Irish. This is a very bloody period, and these people aren't associated to the factions, the traditional factions of the Yorkists and the Lancastrian. These are just people living time. Because not only do we have during this whole sort of 30-year period famines, and we have like mini ice age, it's economic turmoil. And what happens when the economy collapses? Young men are out of work, no future, no hope. What they turn to these sort of things to sort of legitimize themselves or to advance themselves or whatever their personal reasons are. It happens all throughout history in every country. When you have a country that's basically on its knees, young people rise up and do their own thing to try and advance themselves in the world, take what you can, just to survive. And this is happening all over the modern UK boundaries, and Ireland. So it's definitely a really bloody period. Like I say, the annals are filled during this time with references to this, warfare. But then what, a year after that, bloody battle in Clare, Waterford is taken by the Butlers. Yeah. So we start to see this almost like royal army.
Did the Butlers physically take it, or do they just inherit it, or what's the crack?
It's gonna be more of you'll have the Butler faction chased down the Fitzgerald faction of the city, effectively, because you would have factions in both major powers had an interest in the city. It was the go-to place for if you needed to bring wine and stuff like that, and so eventually I think
that's exactly it. I know the Waterford itself, if you go down to Waterford Museum, they explain this really well. But Waterford itself is very Lancastrian. They very much support the English king, and the reason why they support the English king and continue to support both the Lancastrians and the Tudors later on was because of the wine. Waterford was a massive rival to New Ross, and so the main thing that they wanted to highlight, Waterford was always highlighted, was that we will serve the king no matter what. So it does make sense that they would be very supportive of the Butlers, and they would push out Fitzgerald rivals and stuff within the city and stuff. Because you see that throughout, and even when Waterford is at its most doomed, it's very anti-Fitzgeralds, because the Fitzgeralds are seen to the people as Waterford as anti-king to them, and the Waterford wants to highlight, look, we're loyal to the English king, and we have every right to this wine because we're so supportive to the English king. And in return, the kings of England do support Waterford and his claim over the wine against New Ross. So that I do find that interesting in itself.
Yeah, and then like say so, but also not like 5 years later during this period, you then have an Anglo-Irish army defeated by O'Connor as well in 1466. So it's not just a case of like these Gaelic clans are attacking each other and raiding each other, and these cities are picking Waterford are picking Lancastrian, and you've got like other ones being Yorkist, and you've also got these Irish families going into English territories and defeating English armies effectively, it's really is just their push into these traditionally held areas. We go on to see that basically by the end of this conflict, the Butlers and the Fitzgerald, well, not so much the Fitzgeralds, but that the Anglo-Norman sort of reach into Gaelic territories and their power bases are basically whittled down to just their headquarters, and
Yeah.
and everything else around them is they are just surrounded. The Fitzgeralds were very good at this time of playing both sides against each other, and
Yeah,
they had
I was
long
gonna get
ties.
into that now.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah.
Especially later on in the War of the Roses, you see that, especially when Henry takes over, you see that even Henry VII even makes a comment that I'll bring up later on.
Yeah.
But yeah, it gets extremely in your face. So the Fitzgeralds, because the Fitzgeralds were in bed with Edward IV, who's now King of England, the Butlers before that were, of course, always going to support the Lancastrians. The Butlers were very much just like Waterford, wants to highlight that they were always loyal to the king. So, and even in the battles leading up to Edward IV, the Butlers had fought in those battles. So, some of the top butlers had been killed off during the War of the Roses in England. They were killed in England. And so, Mac Richard Butler was kind of one of the last standing butlers inside. I think it was around Kilkenny area, wasn't it? He was in.
Yeah.
And he had raised his levies up because kind of became one of the last, like, the War of the Roses then had really focused in Ireland at this point because the Butlers were kind of that last stand of the Lancasters against the Yorks, and the Fitzgeralds had become that kind of beacon of what it is to be a Yorkist. So once again, the Fitzgeralds have raised up their armies and they had marched down to fight the Butlers. And as it's been highlighted, the Butlers left Waterford for some strange reason. Their main army was in Waterford. They left out the walls of Waterford for reasons I still don't quite understand why they would do that. But they met the Fitzgeralds just outside a small village, which would eventually be known after the battle as the Battle of Bloody Village. And if you play with the Gaelic word for bloody and stuff, you'd end up with Pilltown. So now it's called Pilltown, not because the people are constantly popping pills there, but because the town, the village, and the river itself. So what would happen was that the river got filled with so much blood after the battle that even the river running through Pilltown was covered in blood for months and months after.
I have a theory.
Because of the amount of blood.
I have a theory that basically, because the Fitzgerald army had tried to take a Butler castle, really unmanned castle, just before the Battle of Pilltown and lost, I have a theory that he assumed that they weren't a well-equipped or well-led army and basically felt that he could take them. If they can't take one of his undermanned castles, then there's sure as heck not gonna stand up to his army. So that's what's led me to believe that. But that he's maybe just thought they were just a ragtag bunch of lads who just weren't well organized, well drilled, and well disciplined. So that would be my sort of 20p, 20 euro, whatever you want to call it, just into that, like
what you called Mac Richard Butler was captured in that battle. What's really important about that as well, as part of his ransom, the Butler family had to give over the Book of Cashel and the Book of Carrick, which is written in, although both of them are missing, it's believed both were written in Irish, and also the ransom note that's given between the Butlers and the Fitzgerald. Those ransom notes are also written in Irish as well. So it's just to highlight the fact that as the Tudors would call them later on, the Irish lords, they're speaking Irish. It's just to really highlight the fact that they're not speaking English. These are two, as you would say, meant to be English lords in Ireland, but in fact, they're speaking Irish amongst each other. And the books that they have, the Book of Cashel and the Book of Carrick, are both in Irish as well, which goes to show how Gaelicized these lords had become by 1462. So later on, when the Tudors, and also earlier on as well, when they're referring to the lords in Ireland as Irish lords, they pretty much are Irish lords. They're speaking Irish, and as the Desmond Fitzgerald attire, they're dressing Irish as well. So quite interesting, very interesting. Like,
yeah, I mean, there's rebellions going on all over the place. 1460s is just mad. Even in England, it's just absolutely just everyone is going for everyone. And like I said, this is But there's a family that I often feel just, they were a big player and they became a big player sort of towards the early 16th century. Is the Burkes. These guys. We've often said about the Butlers and the Fitzgeralds and the Burkes. These three sort of. I know the Burkes eventually get overshadowed by the Fitzgeralds and the Butlers, and however they often are. This family is another Anglo-Norman family. That they are just that, although way more Gaelicized than either side would. Just they basically started taking Irish surnames and everything like. But yeah, they're in a massive fight with the O'Donnells. The O'Donnells are pushing into.
Oh,
yeah.
Because I always wondered what happened to the Burke, because you don't see the Burkes popping up until afterwards.
Yeah.
We'll get into that later, like, because that's your specialty as well, like.
Yeah.
That famous battle that happens in 1504.
Yeah.
We'll get into that later.
Yeah,
because I kind of want to put that into kind of the aftermath of the War of the Roses.
Yeah,
I'm also wondering what's the Burkes in the whole War of the Roses. You think they would highlight it, but they were a rivalship with the O'Donnells. That makes a lot more sense now, what they were doing.
Well,
and I suppose they were supporting the Fitzgeralds as well. The Burkes, were they?
No, by this time you've got many branches. The main branch is actually so focused with Donegal and how many that Kingdom of the O'Kellys, that they're trying to sort of gain that sort of overlordship of there. They really are. You've got the O'Malleys, who've just obviously been, who were actually involved in the Corker Baskin massacre, the McMahons and the O'Briens. I often think if they were the fleet that ferried the O'Donnells down. But the Burkes are just completely overrun with O'Donnell raids into their territory. The Battle of Glanach, the O'Donnells advanced into the Burkes and beat the Burkes and the O'Briens. So that was they had the O'Donnells and the O'Connor Sligos going down into Connacht, wrecking all around them. The Burkes got the O'Briens. Logistically, I'm going to say maybe the O'Briens of Arran, to help sort of get them across, but they were absolutely slapped at the Battle of Glanach. So, and then you have only 2 years later, the Burkes sort of go back and they sack Cadbury against the MacDonners and the O'Donnells. So they are completely, and the O'Connor of Sligo, obviously. But they go across with another O'Connor branch. So they're trying to put their own sort of figurehead in the O'Connor clans to try and gain that sort of dominance over the area. So, and they did the same with the O'Kellys straight after. They got an O'Kelly heir or lord and went, you'll be the king of O'Kellys, basically we'll run the show. So, but they are just completely, because they're surrounded, they've got the O'Kellys to their right, they've got the O'Donnells to their north, the O'Connor Sligos to their northeast. They're completely just so busy with that. They're and that just shows how active these Gaelic families were pushing into these Anglo-Norman territories. That they're basically overrunning Connacht at the time. So it's just crazy. Never mind.
Yeah. It does seem mental, all right. And out of that, obviously, the aftermath of the Battle of Piltown, one person that really starts to stand out is Thomas Fitzgerald, the 7th Earl of Desmond. And he really starts to become that dominating figure, not just in Ireland, but also in England. When he comes into the room in London, to do the London court and stuff, basically people are like, he's the one especially according to Edward IV, King of England, he's the one that ends the War of the Roses. By the way, the War of the Roses isn't finished yet. There's a lot more chapters left. But according to the Yorks at this point, the war is over, and here comes in when he marches into the room, he's one of the boys. And there's kind of this kind of romantic flair to him because he comes from this kind of romantic, mysterious, pagan kind of land. So he's kind of got this handsome sex appeal, which is actually recorded, by the way. A lot of people do record him as absolutely beautiful and handsome. And he comes in there with this big Kerry accent on him. and he just charms everybody in the room. I can't do a Kerry accent, so I won't be doing one right now. But you can just imagine today, just this madman coming into the room, and Edward the Fourth absolutely loves and adores him. But one group, he's not loved by everyone, and one group that do not like him are the Woodvilles. The Woodvilles have recently married in with Edward the Fourth behind the back of Warwick, wasn't it, the
Yeah.
kingmaker? So they inside the court there was already massive tensions, and already Thomas Fitzgerald had already stepped on basically the biggest doo-doo you could in the court without even realizing it. He just thought he was the bee's knees, the boys, because he was going around having a laugh with everybody, charming everybody around him. We won't go into more detail about that, but your imagination can work its way around that. But he was a man that was heavily loved in the English court. According to him, that's what he thought, not realizing he had made enemies in the English court without even realizing it. And so when he returned to Ireland, one man that would go out of his way to actually murder, have him captured and executed was a man called John Tiptoft, the butcher of England. And so in 1463, he actually came to Ireland, kidnapped both the Kildare Fitzgerald and Thomas Fitzgerald, the 7th Earl, and basically said that they had been breaking the statutes of Kilkenny, which they pretty much were. They were breaking it in front of everybody's face. They were speaking Irish. They were switching over to English. They were wearing Irish clothing. Everybody knew it. And according to them, it was perfectly fine because they had won the Battle of Piltown. Everything, they were the saviors of the land. But that's not how people seen it. Prejudice, racism, that was perfectly acceptable back then. And so were the statutes of Kilkenny. And so Thomas Fitzgerald had his head cut off, and even worse still, inside a church, his head was just decapitated. And so with that, a rebellion would kick off between Desmonds, the Fitzgeralds in a whole, against the Yorkists. And this would actually, surprising enough, I actually thought this would just last a year. This actually went on from 1463 all the way to 1471, so about 10 years. And even on top of that, even when Edward had apologized and wanted to, fix the problems and stuff, there was actually in around 1465, there was actually further laws brought in to enforced, by the way, into the Irish Parliament to basically fix up the law, kind of update the statutes of Kilkenny and reinforce them that the Irish need to act more English. And this was all against Desmond Fitzgerald. So personally, when I had a quick look through the War of the Roses and stuff, I thought this rebellion, Desmond's rebellion against the Yorkists, I thought that had lasted only about a year. In fact, it lasts all the way from 1463 to 1471. That's a good period of time during the War of the Roses. And so that eventually does end in 1471. And they basically what the Yorkists do is they kind of pay off and they turn around and says, okay, we recognize you as the Earl of Desmond. We apologize for all the actions taken against you. And at that point, Thomas was the successor to Thomas Fitzgerald, the 8th Earl of Desmond, had become so powerful in his own right, he could basically do what he wanted. But at this point, you wouldn't see the Desmond Fitzgeralds being at a rush to go to the English court. There's a huge divide at this point between Desmond Fitzgeralds and the Yorkists. The Kildare Fitzgeralds, interestingly enough, still play kind of devil's advocate. They're still on the fence between England and Ireland. And it's one of the biggest, you see so many people, historians, disagreeing and arguing all the time. Were the Kildare Fitzgeralds English? Were they Irish? Were they both? It's one of the biggest arguments. And it really is, a lot of people take from the War of the Roses at this point to argue the case, were the Kildare Fitzgeralds English or were they Irish? Which is interesting. I myself just believe that they played on the fence and were trying to milk the system as much as they could for their own benefit, because every single time they do any action, it benefits themselves. So that's my personal view on the Kildare Fitzgeralds, that they were still playing the Game of Thrones and they were still best friends with the Desmond Fitzgeralds. We can't forget that. One of their best friends was still the Desmond Fitzgeralds, wherever Kildare Fitzgerald went, somehow the Desmond Fitzgeralds were always with them, except for when they were obviously in the English court, which would cause problems in the Tudor period, especially around 1534. But that's my view around that whole Desmond Rebellion and stuff.
Well,
The massive divide. It's at that point in 1463 that the game changes. The Desmond Fitzgeralds aren't no longer the proud Yorkists they once were. They're now kind of more broken away from England, which is quite interesting in itself.
Yeah, the Yorkists basically lost a massive pool of manpower and wealth and influence to their cause. Although they had thought that the cause had whittled down and they sort of got, the better handle like Cassian's, not realising that, what the Earl of Warwick was up to, because he was obviously very annoyed with the whole Woodville sort of shenanigans that had gone on, marrying a divorcee, as we know from, the history of the monarchy in England, not a happy about divorcees and marriage. So, it's it is a sort of bad time for them. They don't realize it, but it's a bad time for them to lose this powerful friend, the Desmond Fitzgerald.
Yeah.
I mean, your argument with the links to Kildare and English court. I mean, you use the what they're up to, their actions to sort of justify whether they're Irish or Gaelic or English, but also taking into account their ongoing rivalry with the Butlers, which we covered in another video. So please, we'll put links. So and that can how their actions towards the Butlers, who are most definitely English, the main branch anyway, are most definitely English. So in terms of culture and custom and allegiance. So yeah, how they would deal, I would agree with you. I'd say they're more just on the fence, just trying to see which way the wind blows. And as most families were at this time and before and after, we often try and justify, oh, they're traitors to this and really you just put in the context, they're just trying to stick with the strongest person who they think's going to provide them with the best.
So with that, the Fitzgeralds at first think that they're in a massive disadvantage. They just really annoyed Henry VII. They don't know if this was going to be a war between basically Ireland at this point and England. However, Henry VII straight away knows he doesn't have, after doing the War of the Roses that went on from 1455 all the way up to 1487, he knows he doesn't have the financial or the men to go and invade Ireland and push out the Fitzgeralds. So what he does instead is that he invites the Kildare Fitzgerald, Garrod Fitzgerald, who is also has the title the Great Earl of Ireland. He basically, and which is kind of like his own self-crown. I think it's in one of the annals as well. It literally just proclaims him the Great Earl of Ireland, and that's basically what he's known as at this point. And he's invited to a banquet over in Ireland, and over in England. Why am I going over to Ireland for? He goes over to England anyway, and as part of this banquet, he ends up having a laugh. The two of them, both Henry VII. This is the first time they met, by the way. Henry VII and Garrod Fitzgerald end up socialising, having a good old laugh amongst each other. Because Garrod Fitzgerald is such a charming fella. And this is recorded about how, just like Desmond Fitzgerald previously, Garrod Fitzgerald, the Earl of Kildare, is just as charming as the other Fitzgeralds. They end up having a blast, having a laugh. And as a kind of finishing touch to the evening, Henry VII brings over his servant. And the servant actually is Lambert Simmons, who's meant to be the new King of England. So instead of executing him, Henry VII basically just turns around to Garrod Fitzgerald and just has a laugh about it. Oh, silly you, bringing over this rebel. I turned him into a servant, This is only a silly little war between two noble families, and that's the way it kind of left it. Instead of having this bloody war that England was already sick of by 1487, instead he just laughs it off. And so that pretty much ends the War of the Roses in Ireland, in England. However, it doesn't fully finish it up, not until 1492. And in 1492, the Fitzgeralds, both the Kildare Fitzgeralds and the Desmond Fitzgeralds, are back to their old tricks. because a person called Warbeck suddenly arrives. And Warbeck arrives in Cork, and straight away the people of Cork crown him the new king of England. And the mayor of Cork completely rebels, and this is where Cork gets its title, the Rebel County, because from now on they will be known as the Rebel County. And so Warbeck he raises an army, gets over to England. The rebellion fails, but at the same time, both the Desmond Fitzgeralds and the Kildare Fitzgeralds also go into rebellion in Ireland, right? They also send another Fitzgerald over with Warbeck. He ends up getting killed as well. However, Garrod Fitzgerald and Marcy Fitzgerald both rebel, and Sir Edward Poynings has to go over and sort them all out. He sends over, I think it was about 4,000 men, come with him over to Ireland to try to sort out the Irish lords and the Gaelic as well. One of the first things that Poynings does is he goes into the Irish Parliament and he reinforces and updates the statutes of Kilkenny, and they're referred to as Poynings' Law. So he's really kind of put down the mark. Straight away, marches up to the north of Ireland to sort out the Gaelic lords. He gets a few good skirmishes here and there. Vice versa, the Gaelic kind of getting a few skirmishes. However, one of the biggest strengths the Gaelic have is just causing Edward's Poynings to kind of wander around in the middle of no man for ages like they usually do, until eventually what happens is that Desmond Fitzgerald marches his way over to Waterford, the whole Kilkenny area, and causes problems with the butlers. He really smashes in the butlers. At the same time, Garrod Fitzgerald, who's not rebelling, right? Instead, his brothers are rebelling. So it's the whole time Garrod Fitzgerald is literally to Sir Edward Poynings, anytime he meets him, it's like, oh, I'm not rebelling. I'm completely loyal to the Tudors, always have, always will be. That was my brother, nothing to do with me. And that's literally what he does. So his brothers, the Fitzgerald's brothers, go around capturing English castles and either sack them or reinforce them against Poynings. Poynings, at the same time, his biggest problem is the fact that the Desmond Fitzgeralds are marching around Butler territory, especially around Waterford and stuff. So Poynings has to quickly march all the way down to Waterford. He then bumps into the Desmond Fitzgeralds, and between the jigs and the rails, they get into negotiations against each other because Poynings does not have the resources to take on Desmond Fitzgerald. As I was saying earlier, I can't really reinforce the source, but it's believed he may have had a force of 7,000 men. Against his 4,000, Edward Poynings was well outnumbered. So Poynings goes back to England, and Henry VII goes into renegotiations with the Fitzgeralds. In return, Desmond Fitzgerald, Marcy Fitzgerald ends up getting Cork, Youghal, Kinsale, and all the other ports around the Munster area. He pretty much becomes completely dominant, and with that, he's able to ship in more guns, more ammunition, more weapons in from Italy, the Holy Roman Empire, and various other places to really up the ante into the Fitzgeralds, as we will see later on. And what's his name? Garrod Fitzgerald was arrested, but because he cannot, basically, Tudors cannot control Ireland, he basically releases Garrod Fitzgerald, and he says to Garrod Fitzgerald's face, all of Ireland cannot govern the Earl. Then let this Earl govern all of Ireland. And that's basically saying, look, you're pretty much King of Ireland. You go run Ireland any way you want. Just do it in the name of the King of England and we'll have no problems, you know. And that's basically what Garrod Fitzgerald does. He goes back to Ireland. He gets rid of his rival because now Desmond Fitzgerald and the Earl of Kildare have no problems pumping more guns and more weapons into Ireland and really reinforcing. So by the time we get into the very end, the tippy-toppy end of the War of the Roses, the Fitzgeralds are at the strongest they've ever been, you know, and they're very dangerous at this point. And one of your specialties that you have a whole video on, the Battle of Knockdoe in 1504, really shows that off, doesn't it?
Yeah, we have the rising Burkes. They've used this time to solidify their position, more reinforce it because they didn't. You have Clanrickard Burkes then rising in this period. He's harassing the Mayo Burkes in the north. He's basically around 1475. The Burkes had sort of taking O'Kelly territory. The McWilliam put a O'Kelly chieftain in. Then you have Clanrickard Burke coming in and putting his in, and he's taken over proxy state in. He marches down south towards Clare, Limerick. He's attacking. He attacks 5 castles in O'Kelly territory. Really harasses them. The Mayo Burkes are frustrated. Now these are more of an anglicised branch of the family, probably of equal sort of standing and power, and they go to Kildare and basically turn around and say to him, "Help us out. This man, Clanrickard, is fully Gaelicised, wrecking all around him." And eventually he marches across there. He's been looking for a reason to Clanrickard at the heels there, at the knees for a while, but he's not really been breaking too many laws that he can, as Lord Deputy or hired as a high official in the Irish government. He hasn't really got the power to be going across there, so he finds his reason to go across, and they have the Battle of Knockdoe. Now, the Battle of Knockdoe, just to show how rich and powerful Kildare was, it's the first cannons were brought across by the Fitzgeralds. Didn't get to use them at the battle. The various reasons for that not happening. But there's also the first recorded battle of guns being used as well. So it's the army's a very advanced army, and it's really sort of they both have gallowglass smashing into each other. So one of the last sort of pitched battles of like there's lines of gallowglass slamming into each other, old style, because this is the start of modern warfare encroaching into Ireland, thanks to the Fitzgeralds' vast amounts of wealth and the ability to control the ports. These are the armies that it's their army that has it, and it really starts to show the ineffectiveness of the gallowglass at the time, the standard way they've been fighting for so long. Yes, so he pushes Clanrickard Burke, and he escapes, but he ends up spending his life in the hills like some renegade. Battle of Knockdoe, that's where it comes to a pinnacle of it, and it just really reinforces that this man Fitzgerald has reaches from Galway to Dublin. He really is unchallenged in his rule. He'd been given basically the power, and any land he took, Henry VII said, "Take it for yourself. It's not taken for the crown." So he basically had free rein to just go. He goes up to Ulster and wrecks all around there. So he's unchallenged. He basically is King of Ireland in all, like say, all but name. Right.
And I think that's where we can finish it up. It's really exciting, the War of the Roses, and I hope people spend more time kind of get into the nitty gritty of the War of the Roses, because it's always a chapter we kind of skip on. Historians, especially historians who are into later 1916, Easter Rising, so on and so forth, they kind of take bits out of the War of the Roses just to back up, 800 years. But the War of the Roses itself is a really interesting war. And as we were saying there, it's the foundation of what would become later on the Irish identity, what it is to be Irish. Because before then, even during that and slightly after it, the Fitzgeralds in Ireland were recognised as the Old English. And it wasn't that word didn't mean that they were English from England. It meant that they were foreign, that they were from this foreign land. They really didn't have any rights to be kings of Ireland. And vice versa, the Gaelic were referred to as Gaelic. But on the outside to Spain and England and stuff, the Fitzgerald, if you read any of the letters and stuff, were referred to as Irish. And once again, they weren't referred to as Irish because they were born in Ireland. It was, kind of a racial thing. As funny as that sounds, they were so foreign to the English and the Holy Roman Empire at this point that they were Irish, they were barbaric, they were barbarian because they spoke this barbarian Irish language. They dressed as one of the barbarians. And it wasn't a barbarian as in they were really stupid in a way. It was because they were so mysterious that they were kind of pagan and foreign to the likes of people who were living in the continent of Europe and in England. And that's basically what the Fitzgeralds resembled. And so as strange as it sounds, that's kind of the foundation of what eventually becomes as we move into the Tudor period and then on to the 1700s and stuff. That's the foundation of what it is to be Irish. As weird as it is, to be foreign and strange is our foundation. It's kind of strange in a way, but it's still somewhat in a positive way, because it's kind of like, there's a kind of romantic kind of mystique to it, So
yeah, I'd agree.
it's interesting.
Yeah, no, I agree. This is definitely, we've had many discussions where we say the Tudor period is really the start of the English invasion of Ireland, when they start to, this nationalism starts to come up. And again, this Irish sort of nationalism as a national identity. Obviously, we had, with our fellow clansmen in the north and the east and west and south, same history, same language, same traditions, even the same families migrating between each other. And I've often said that I believe the identity of Ireland existed, the country existed, but then you had the minor country of your territory, of your clan. It was still very feudal at the same time. These had different cultures. You had very settled areas of Cork, and then you had the migratory clans in the north, who did have settlements, as much to, I know the Victorian era tried to claim it as basically empty to legitimize the claim of the plantations, the earlier plantations, but which is another topic for another day. But this really almost galvanized the Irish cause, as you were, against an enemy that was now, it had been there for a long time, but it now was like English v Irish. It's definitely the foundation for that. And so ignoring the Anglo-Norman invasion, because as I said, we've talked about that before. But yeah, it's definitely this is the I would call this is the start. This is the start of it all. Basically, the start of the Tudors would be the start of the problems for the next,
Yeah,
right,
and it's quite funny because we would refer it to, I always look at it as kind of an English problem, because just as Ireland is settling down, the English would come over and cause all the mess and stuff. And I find it strange that the English would refer to as the Irish problem, that they just couldn't assimilate into English ways. Why can't? And Winston Churchill sums it all up at the end of the Irish War of Independence. He literally turns around and says, why couldn't the Irish just be English? And when I was reading that, it really just dawned on me that that's the problem from the very start. The English just do not understand the Irish. Why can't they just be civilized? And even furthermore, that foundation comes from the Roman Empire, that idea of what it is to be civilized. So it's quite interesting, that it's all interesting.
We've had that discussion before, but there's actually laws and the way the Irish were getting on, even in the earlier periods, were probably in modern standards are considered more civilized than the English prices. So it is again another topic for another day. So yeah, but we'll leave it there. So I'll let you close it. So yeah. So thanks very much, guys, for tuning in.
Thanks very much, guys. My brain is just mind blowing for the amount of stuff that we could still even talk about all day. If there's any subject you'd like us to cover, definitely comment below. Comment below what you thought overall about the War of the Roses. Is there anything specifically you'd like us to go back over? Because God, there's so much information and so much we can learn, and yet it's complete virgin food. It really hasn't been touched, and really needs people to dig in, because it's gorgeous. Like War of the Roses, I find is one of my favorite, most romantic periods in any way, most interesting as well. You have knights, you have ladies, and it's all at its pinnacle and best. And as I was saying there, in 1433, Ireland isn't a backwater that you would think it is. It's having some of the greatest feasts, and Europeans are coming in and completely enchanted by this mystical island. So it's definitely something that people need to dig into. And as always, thanks very much, Michael, for coming over. Definitely, as always, subscribe over the Clans and Dynasties, guys, and all the best.